The morning fog still clung to the iron gates of Oak Ridge Academy when Arthur Pendleton's battered 2009 Ford pickup rolled to a stop along the curb. The engine gave one final, theatrical shudder before going silent, a sound that, on any other block, would have been entirely unremarkable. On Greenvale Drive, however, flanked by a convoy of Range Rovers, blacked-out Teslas, and a silver Bentley Continental that probably cost more than Arthur's childhood home, the old truck's death rattle drew stares like a thunderclap in a cathedral. Arthur didn't notice. Or rather, Arthur noticed everything and chose to be unmoved by all of it. He was 35 years old, built like someone who had spent decades doing things that required both precision and endurance, wide-shouldered, leaned through the middle, with a stillness about him that made some people instinctively lower their voices when he entered a room. His jaw was dusted with a few days of stubble that he kept forgetting to shave. His flannel shirt, red and navy, the collar slightly frayed, was tucked into a pair of dark jeans worn pale at the knees. His work boots were laced tightly, their leather cracked and honest, the kind of boots that told you exactly what kind of man wore them. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Two brown eyes stared back at him, wide with the particular anxiety that only 7-year-olds carry, enormous and unguarded and heartbreaking in its clarity. "You've got your lunch?" he asked. Lily Pendleton nodded, clutching her ladybug print backpack against her chest like a shield. She had her biological father's dark hair and her biological mother's soft, gray eyes, though Arthur couldn't know that without feeling the specific, quiet weight of a grief he had long since learned to carry like a stone in his chest. Always there, never unbearable, a reminder rather than a wound. "And you remember what we said about Connor Sterling?" "Ignore him," Lily recited, in a voice that suggested she had memorized this the way other children memorized multiplication tables. "And if you can't ignore him, find a teacher." She paused. "Or Mrs. Patterson, because she's actually nice." "Good girl." Arthur twisted around in his seat and tugged the collar of her yellow jacket straight. She let him, watching him with those grave gray eyes. "You know what you are, Lilybug?" "What?" "You're the bravest kid I've ever known. And I've known some pretty brave people." That got the smile. The real one, the lopsided one that she only produced when she was caught off guard by feeling loved. It did something to Arthur's chest every time, something that he had no military training to defend against. He climbed out of the truck first and walked around to open her door. It was a small thing, a habit born from countless mornings, but Lily accepted it with the natural dignity of a child who had never been made to feel small by her father. She hopped down onto the sidewalk and took his hand, and together they walked toward the school gates. The other parents parted around them the way water parts around a stone. Not dramatically, it was subtler than that, a slight drift of shoulders, a collective half-turn of heads. Arthur was aware of it without acknowledging it. He was wearing his old flannel on a morning where Cordelia Bassett had shown up in a cream cashmere coat and pearls at 8:15 in the morning. He knew how the scene looked. He simply didn't care in the way that a man who is crouched in a jungle in 40-degree heat with only 30 seconds to decide whether 6 people live or die learns not to care about pearl-draped opinions. He was crouching beside the school's iron side gate, a hinge bolt loose, the gate swinging with a metallic groan that he had noticed on his last 3 drop-offs when Margaret Sterling arrived. She was 42, lacquered and immovable, the kind of woman who had decided sometime in her early 30s that cruelty, deployed with sufficient elegance, counted as personality. She wore a white coat and an expression of permanent, decorative disdain. Her son, Connor, walked 3 feet behind her as though even he was slightly afraid of her. She stopped near the gate. Looked down. Arthur was on one knee, working the hinge pin free with a flathead screwdriver he kept in his jacket pocket the way other people kept pens. "The maintenance staff handles that," she said. Her tone was the verbal equivalent of a wrinkled nose. "It'll take them 3 weeks to file the work order," Arthur said, without looking up. "In the meantime, someone's kid could catch their fingers in it." Margaret Sterling looked at him for a moment with the particular contempt she reserved for people she had already sorted and filed away. Then she looked at Lily, who was watching her with careful, polite neutrality. "Is that your jacket from last year, Lily?" she asked, in a voice that was almost sweet. Lily looked down at the yellow jacket. It was from last year. It was also perfectly clean, perfectly functional, and a color that Lily had chosen herself from the secondhand shop 3 towns over, declaring it the color of butter and sunshine and holding it up with both hands like a trophy. "Yes," Lily said. "Oh." Margaret's smile was small and surgical. "How economical." She moved on. Connor glanced at Lily with the blank, predatory assessment of a boy who had learned from his mother that status was a weapon. Then he, too, was gone. Arthur finished tightening the hinge bolt, tested the gate twice, and stood up. He brushed his hands on his jeans and found Lily looking up at him with an expression he recognized. The careful, contained look of a child who has decided not to show that something hurt. He crouched down to her level. "Hey," he said quietly. Her voice was mean, Lily said. Not a complaint, an observation cataloged and filed. It was. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Some people think that what a person wears tells you who they are. That's a mistake people make when they don't have anything interesting on the inside." Lily considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. "Your boots are interesting." "My boots are extremely interesting," he confirmed. That earned him the real smile again. He kissed the top of her head, watched her walk through the gate and into the schoolyard, and stood for a moment watching her go. This small, precise gift that Marcus had left him, until the ache in his chest settled back into its familiar, manageable place. He didn't see the woman watching him from the steps of the school's administrative wing, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, a single line between her brows that suggested she was recalibrating something she had already decided. Eleanor Vance watched the man in the worn flannel shirt straighten up, brush off his jeans, and stand quietly until the little girl in the yellow jacket had disappeared around the corner of the building. Then she watched him turn and walk back toward the battered truck without any hurry, without any self-consciousness, moving with the unhurried, contained economy of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. She had been observing people for 32 years, most of that time professionally. She had learned to read a room the way other people read the news, quickly, efficiently, without sentimentality. What she had just watched, the loose gate repaired on a school's behalf without being asked, the child answered with honesty instead of hollow comfort, the quiet refusal to be diminished, did not fit into any category she had prepared for Oak Ridge Academy's morning drop-off. She made a small, private note of it and went inside. The rain arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon without the courtesy of a warning. Eleanor had been expecting a dry week. She had checked 3 weather apps that morning, a habit born from the particular paranoia of someone who spent too much time scheduling things. And so she had made the mistake of parking on Greenvale Drive rather than in Oak Ridge's covered guest lot. By the time she finished her meeting with Principal Holloway and stepped outside with her portfolio and her phone and the distinct irritation of someone whose time is too valuable to waste on mechanical failure, her Aston Martin had decided to demonstrate, in no uncertain terms, that luxury was not the same as reliability. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times. A clicking sound, then nothing. Eleanor sat very still for a moment, rain hammering the roof, and performed the brief, private calculus of a woman who did not ask for help as a matter of philosophical principle. She could call her driver, Oliver. He was 40 minutes away in the city. She could call the dealership's roadside service. She'd never used it, had in fact forgotten it existed, and wait however long that took, in the rain, on a residential street, which was not a scenario she intended to add to her biography. She was reaching for her phone when there was a knock on the driver's side window. She looked up. A face looked back at her from the rain. Unhurried, slightly damp, familiar in the vague way of faces she had cataloged and not yet filed. The flannel shirt, the worn jaw. She rolled down the window 4 inches. "I'm fine," she said. "I haven't said anything yet," the man pointed out. She regarded him. "You were going to offer to help." "I was going to ask if you needed a jump or if it was something else," he said. "But fine works too." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. His eyes were the color of wood smoke, a dark, muted gray-green, and they held the particular quality of patience that she associated with people who had spent a great deal of time waiting for things that mattered. Not the passive patience of the incurious. Something deliberate, trained. She got out of the car. The rain hit her immediately. She was wearing a charcoal blazer that cost $1,100 and was not remotely waterproof. It turned over 3 times and stopped, she said, because if she was going to allow this, she was going to be useful. He nodded once, held out his hand for the key fob. She gave it to him. He popped the hood, disappeared beneath it with the particular efficiency of someone who did not need to think about what he was looking for, and emerged 90 seconds later with grease on 2 fingers and an expression that was not quite a smile. "Fuel pump relay," he said. "Takes about 4 minutes. You have the part?" He walked to the back of his truck, still parked behind her, hazards blinking orange in the gray rain, and came back with a small relay switch. She watched his hands work. They were, she noticed, not the hands of a laborer in the way that word implied a certain gracelessness. They were very large, very certain hands, with calluses in specific places that spoke of specific kinds of work, and they moved with an absolute economy of motion that she recognized from a different context entirely. The surgeons who had sat across from her in boardrooms, discussing medical tech acquisitions, had hands like that. Hands that had learned not to waste a single movement. "You went to university," she said. It came out more like an accusation than she intended. He glanced at her from beneath the hood. Rain dripped off the brim of his, she noticed now, absolutely ancient baseball cap. "What makes you say that?" "The way you speak. The syntax. The vocabulary you just used to explain the relay issue was technically precise in a way that doesn't come from watching YouTube tutorials." A beat of silence. He went back to the relay. "West Point," he said finally. "Engineering and strategic operations." Eleanor processed this with the same speed she processed all unexpected information. Instantly, internally, and without revealing the adjustment on her face. "That's a very good school." "It is," he agreed pleasantly, as though this were a perfectly ordinary conversation and not being conducted in the rain outside a private elementary school. With him performing a car repair, she was beginning to suspect he was doing for free. He closed the hood, held out the fob. The engine started on the first attempt. "What do I owe you?" she said. "Nothing." He was already moving back toward his truck. "That's not." She stopped herself. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't angling for gratitude or recognition. He was just leaving, the way people leave when they've done something because it needed doing and not because of what it might return to them. It was so entirely alien to every context she operated in that she stood in the rain for a moment longer than was practical, watching the battered Ford pull away. She got back into her car. The leather seats were warm. The rain was loud. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about calloused hands that moved like a surgeon's, and a West Point degree that wore a flannel shirt, and a little girl in a yellow jacket who had been told her economical jacket was worth commenting on, and whose father had crouched to her eye level and said something that made her smile the way children smile when they've been surprised by safety. Eleanor Vance had not been surprised by safety in a very long time. She put the car in drive. The nightmares always began the same way. Not with the explosion itself. That came later, a wall of pressure and light, and the particular terrible silence that follows a sound too large for the human ear to process in real time. They began before that. They began with the morning. With the color of the light coming through the dust in the air, that specific amber gold that existed nowhere else on Earth. A light that, in another life, he might have found beautiful. They began with Marcus laughing. Marcus Webb had laughed the way he did everything else, fully, without reservation, with his whole face involved. He'd been from North Carolina, from a town small enough that everyone knew everyone and large enough that leaving it felt like escape. He'd had his mother's eyes, deep set, very dark, and his father's shoulders, and a complete inability to be quiet for more than 45 consecutive seconds. In 10 years of friendship, the last 8 of which had been spent in situations that required silence as a survival skill, Arthur had never once managed to cure him of it. He'd also been the finest soldier Arthur had ever commanded, bar none. In the dream, Arthur turned toward the laugh. Marcus was standing in the amber light, 28 years old, in full kit, grinning at something Arthur couldn't see. And Arthur knew, with the specific horror of a dreamer who has dreamed this enough times to recognize the shape of what's coming, that he needed to say something. Move. Pull Marcus back. Change the sequence of the next 11 seconds. He couldn't. He could never. The light changed. The silence happened. And Arthur woke up with the sheets damp and his fists pressed into the mattress and the 5-year-old, very specific grief of a man who had made a promise to a dying friend and had gotten up every morning since then in fulfillment of it. He lay still for a moment, breathing, orienting himself. The bedroom ceiling, the streetlight coming through the curtain gap, the small, familiar sounds of the house, the refrigerator's hum, the creak of the second porch step in the wind. Home. Safe. Then the smaller sound, the pad of bare feet on hardwood floor. The door opened a crack. A small face appeared in the gap, gray eyes wide in the half-dark, hair chaotic from sleep, holding a stuffed rabbit named Gerald that had lost one eye in the wash 2 years ago and been promoted to chief rabbit in consequence. Dad, Arthur exhaled. Hey, Bug. Lily came in without further invitation, the way she always did, and climbed up onto the bed with the efficient scramble of someone much too small for the task. She settled against his side, rabbit tucked under one arm, and put her small hand over his. The bad dream? She asked. Yeah. About your friend? Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. 7 years old, and she had already learned, from watching him, from the particular calibration of growing up alongside grief, not to fill silence with noise. It was one of the things about her that consistently undid him in ways he had no defenses for. I think he would be really happy, she said eventually. About us. Arthur looked at the ceiling. In the amber streetlight, he thought about Marcus Webb at 28, laughing in the dust. He thought about the last clear thing Marcus had said to him, in the medical transport, when it was still possible to pretend that the word last didn't apply. Promise me, Art. She's going to need someone who doesn't break. Yeah, Arthur said, around something that had lodged itself in his throat. I think he would. Lily nodded, satisfied, as though this were a matter requiring periodic confirmation and was now confirmed. She repositioned Gerald, yawned enormously, and was asleep again in 4 minutes, with the complete, unself-conscious trust of a child who has never once doubted, in the small hours of any night, that she was in the safest place in the world. Arthur lay awake a while longer, her small hand still on his. He thought about the school gate, about Margaret Sterling's surgery-precise voice saying how economical to a 7-year-old in a yellow jacket. He thought about the gathering pressure of something he had been ignoring for months, the specific, cold instinct that told him, in the way such instincts are rarely wrong, that it was not going to stop at passive-aggressive comments. He would not let anything touch her. Not this. Not the innocent, fierce, impossible goodness of this child who comforted her nightmaring father with the certainty of someone much older and wiser and more tired than she had any right yet to be. He would protect her, whatever the cost of the disguise, whatever it required of him, the flannel shirts, the battered truck, the careful performance of ordinary life. He would keep wearing it, keep keeping her safe inside it, for as long as she needed him to. He had made a promise to a man in the dust and the amber light, and Arthur Pendleton did not break promises. It was a Ming Dynasty reproduction, though the school's literature insisted it was museum quality, and displayed it in the main corridor with a plaque that described it as a symbol of Oak Ridge Academy's commitment to cultural appreciation and academic excellence. At 11 inches tall and hand-painted in cobalt and white, it sat in a locked glass case that was, in practice, unlocked approximately 40% of the time due to budget cuts to the facility's staff. Connor Sterling was 13, bored, and had grown up in a house where consequences had never meaningfully applied to him. Lily had been assigned corridor cleanup duty that afternoon, a rotating responsibility for all middle grade students, entirely innocuous, requiring a small cart and a broom. She had been working quietly near the display case when Connor passed in the hall with 2 of his satellite friends. He slowed, looked at Lily, looked at the case. The sequence of events, as Lily would later describe them in the quiet, careful voice she used when she was trying very hard not to cry. Connor shoulder-checked the display case. The unlocked door swung open. The vase tipped. Lily reached out, instinctively, stupidly, with the reflex of someone who doesn't want something beautiful to break, and her hand caught the vase halfway, which slowed its fall, but didn't stop it. The vase hit the floor in 3 pieces. Connor looked at the vase, looked at Lily's extended hand, looked at his 2 friends, and then back at Lily with an expression that was entirely, chillingly deliberate. "Oh my God," he said. "She broke it." Lily came home that afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment without speaking, her backpack still on, her face doing the terrible, contained work of a child who has decided to hold something in until she is absolutely certain she is in a safe enough place to let it go. Arthur looked at her from the stove, where he'd been heating soup. He set the spoon down. "Lily." She made a sound that was not a word, a small, compressed, breaking sound. And then she was crying. And he was across the kitchen, and he had her, backpack and all, held against his chest with one large hand on the back of her head and the other arm wrapped entirely around her. "Tell me," he said quietly, into her hair. She told him, all of it, haltingly, in fragments, with the particular incoherence of a child trying to describe an injustice for which she doesn't yet have the vocabulary. How Connor had done it on purpose. How the teacher on duty hadn't seen. How Mrs. Sterling had appeared, somehow, within 20 minutes, with the school's principal and a face full of cold satisfaction. How they had told Lily she would need to come back with her father for a formal inquiry. How Connor had stood in the hallway after and smiled at her. Arthur listened to every word. He held her, and he listened, and he did not, in front of her, allow a single thing he was feeling to reach his face. When she was quiet, he pulled back slightly, cupped her face in both hands. These large, scarred hands, capable of terrifying things, now holding this child's small, wet face with absolute gentleness. "Did you break it?" he asked. "No," Lily said. "I tried to catch it." "I know," he said simply. "They're going to say I did." "They might." "Dad." Her voice cracked on the word, and what came after it was the thing that broke something clean and cold loose inside his chest. "I don't want to be a burden. I know the school is expensive, and I know you work really hard. And if they make us pay for it, stop." His voice was very quiet. "Stop right there, Lilybug. You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. You are the reason I get up in the morning. Do you understand me?" She looked at him with those gray eyes, still wet, still uncertain. "I will handle the school," he said. "I will handle all of it. I need you to trust me." "I do," she said, as if it were the simplest true thing in the world, as if the sentence required no examination whatsoever. After she was asleep, Arthur sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark. He had his phone in his hand, not the one he used for calls to the garage, or for Lily's school texts, or for ordering groceries. The other one, the one with a single contact, and an encryption level that would have made the NSA moderately envious, and which he had not used in 8 months. He turned it over in his fingers, put it back in his pocket. Not yet. Not yet. He still had options that didn't require burning down the curtain. He would go to the inquiry. He would be polite and reasonable and give the system exactly one honest chance to work. Behind his eyes, something that had been quiet and patient for a very long time had opened one eye. The conference room on Oak Ridge Academy's second floor was called the Holbrook Suite, named for a former board member who had donated enough money to have his name on a room and, apparently, his aesthetic sensibility inflicted on everyone who used it. It featured mahogany everything: table, paneling, chair frames, and portraits of former principals who stared down from the walls with the expressions of men who had never doubted anything. Arthur arrived at 6:58 for a 7 o'clock meeting, because he was the kind of person who arrived precisely when he said he would. He put on a clean flannel. He owned 6. They were good shirts, warm and durable, and he found the opinions of people who found this inadequate to be less interesting than the average weather forecast. He'd left Lily with their neighbor Mrs. Caldwell, kissed her forehead, told her it would be fine, and driven to Oak Ridge in the rain. Richard Sterling was already in the room. He was 45, broad across the shoulders in the manner of someone who had once been athletic and had since allowed that foundation to soften, with the particular face of a man who had spent decades having people agree with him. His suit was worth more than Arthur's truck. He had a city councilman's practiced handshake and a city councilman's eyes, which were not the same as his handshake. He sat at the head of the table, though it was not his table, in a room that was not his room, with the arrangement of a man who intended to perform ownership of both. Margaret Sterling sat to his right. Principal Holloway, a small, careful man who had the look of someone navigating a long-running hostage situation with no visible exit strategy, sat to his left. 2 school board members bookend the table like ornamental columns. A school district attorney was present in the corner, laptop open. Eleanor Vance sat apart from the Sterling block, at the table's far end, with her portfolio closed in front of her and her face in the configuration Arthur had come to think of as her operational setting. Very still, very alert, taking in more than she was showing. Their eyes met briefly as Arthur entered. Something passed across her expression that he couldn't immediately name. He sat down. The meeting proceeded with the surface formality of a process that had already decided its outcome and was now performing the paperwork around it. Holloway read the incident report. The district attorney noted that the vase was valued at $12,000 and that liability would need to be assigned. Margaret Sterling gave a prepared statement about the safety and integrity of the school's cultural collection, delivered in the pained, selfless tone of a woman doing a deeply unpleasant civic duty. Arthur listened. He watched. He noted who looked at him, how, and when. He answered the questions addressed to him in complete sentences with no unnecessary information, which was the manner of a man who had been interrogated by professionals and therefore found the amateur version slightly tedious. Then Richard Sterling leaned forward. Mr. Pendleton. His voice had the practiced warmth of a politician who had learned warmth as a technique. I think we can all agree that the situation here isn't really about a vase. What is it about? Arthur asked. It's about whether this school can adequately support a student in Lily's circumstances. Sterling spread his hands in the gesture of a man being reasonable. Oak Ridge is an excellent institution. It has a certain standard, academically, socially, financially. Lily is a sweet child, I'm sure, but this isn't the first incident involving her, and there's a question of whether the environment here is. My daughter has a perfect academic record, Arthur said. His voice was pleasant. She has no behavioral reports. The incidents you're referring to are incidents of other students bullying her, which have been documented but not acted upon. A small silence. Margaret Sterling's expression flickered. Mr. Pendleton, she said, pivoting with the smooth ease of long practice. I think your defensive reaction here is quite telling. A more invested parent might consider whether my daughter's tuition is paid 8 months in advance, Arthur said. She has not missed a single day. She has 3 academic commendations this semester. What investment level were you looking for? Eleanor Vance, at the far end of the table, said nothing, but Arthur noticed that the corner of her mouth moved, very slightly, in a way that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. Sterling's warmth-ass technique dropped 2 degrees. He looked at Arthur with his actual eyes for the first time. We're recommending a temporary suspension pending further inquiry, he said. And I want to be frank with you. My wife and I have concerns, genuine, good-faith concerns, about Lily's home environment. A single-income household, an unstable employment situation, the financial pressure of a school like this. He paused, and the pause was surgical. In situations like this, it's sometimes in the child's best interest to involve the appropriate support services, simply to make sure she has everything she needs. The district attorney began typing something. Arthur became very still. Eleanor sat forward. Richard, I'm going to stop you there. As the school's primary patron, I have some. Eleanor. Sterling's voice remained pleasant. The school's patron relationship is deeply valued. But this is a child welfare matter, and it falls under a different jurisdiction. He glanced at the attorney. Mark, what's the procedure for a mandatory CPS referral when there's financial instability in the home? It was very well done. Arthur gave him that. The threat was clean, structured, and shielded behind a scaffold of legal procedure and apparent good faith. We're not attacking you. We're worried about the child. A man with fewer resources, fewer contacts, and less specific knowledge of how these systems operated would have been cornered. Arthur set his hands flat on the mahogany table. He looked at Richard Sterling for a long, quiet moment. Sterling met his gaze with the comfortable assurance of a man who had never once been in a room with someone who outranked him in any way that actually mattered. Arthur said, quite calmly, I'll give you one opportunity to withdraw that suggestion. Sterling blinked. Then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. I'm sorry, one opportunity, Arthur repeated. The pleasant tone had not changed. The volume had not changed. Something underneath the tone had changed, something that Principal Holloway, who had no military background and no particular intuition for danger, nonetheless registered in his feet, because his feet moved him 3 inches back from the table without consulting his brain. Withdraw the CPS threat. Apologize to my daughter for what your son did to that vase, and we can resolve the cost through civil channels and have everyone home by 8. Sterling's face went through several colors. He settled on red, with the particular set of jaw that Arthur associated with men who had confused social power for actual power for so long that having the distinction suggested to them produced something close to outrage. I don't know who you think you are, Sterling said, his voice dropping into the register he used for people he'd already decided to destroy. And then he said something else. He said it quietly, which was somehow worse. He said that Lily's mother had obviously had poor enough judgment in choosing a partner, and that certain kinds of children came from certain kinds of situations, and that perhaps Arthur should ask himself whether raising another man's charity case, his exact words, charity case, was really serving anyone's best interests. The room went very still. Eleanor Vance's portfolio hit the table edge with a sharp crack as she straightened. One of the board members made a sound of discomfort. Principal Holloway had gone the particular color of someone who knows they are watching something they cannot stop and will have to answer for. Arthur said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt and took out a phone. Not his regular phone. This one was matte black, military grade, roughly the size of a deck of cards, with no visible brand markings. He pressed his thumb to the screen, looked at it once, looked at Richard Sterling. "You just made a mistake," he said, in a voice so quiet, so completely level, that it carried none of the markers that voices usually carry when they are delivering a threat. It sounded like a weather report, like a factual statement about current conditions, offered without opinion. "I want you to know exactly when it happened." He dialed a single digit. It rang once. "Initiate Protocol Alpha," Arthur said. "Authorization, Pendleton 7, Sierra, Kilo. Current location, Oak Ridge Academy, Greenvale Drive." Full complement. He ended the call and set the phone on the table. "What on earth?" Margaret Sterling began. 3 minutes and 14 seconds later, the windows of the Holbrook suite began to rattle. The sound arrived before the sight of it, a deep, rhythmic percussion that climbed from the upper registers of traffic noise into something entirely different. Something that vibrated in the sternum rather than the ear. Something that the oldest, most animal part of the human brain correctly identified as large machines doing purposeful things at altitude. Margaret Sterling turned toward the window. Her hand went to her mouth. The courtyard of Oak Ridge Academy, 17,000 square feet of landscaped prestige, with its fountain and its sculpted hedgerows and its memorial bench for a former headmaster, was filling with vehicles. 3 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans with government-grade plates took up the main drive in formation. 2 more pulled in through the staff entrance. Men in dark suits and earpieces stepped out with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this in real conditions, not conference rooms. Above the building, the sound reached its source. 2 Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawks, actual Black Hawks, with the distinctive double-blade signature and the specific downwash pressure that pushed the hedgerows sideways and scattered Margaret Sterling's perfectly coiffed hair across her face, held a low hover above the Academy's west lawn, searchlights cutting through the evening gray. In the Holbrook suite, nobody moved. Nobody, that is, except Arthur, who had slid his chair back with the unhurried motion of a man standing up from a meal, buttoned the top button of his flannel shirt with complete composure, and walked to the window. Richard Sterling had gone the color of old chalk. His district attorney had stopped typing. One of the board members was standing up, not seeming to know why. The courtyard doors opened. The lead agent from the suburban convoy, tall, close-cropped, with the kind of face that had been weathered by things that didn't appear on any official record, walked into the building. Arthur heard the footsteps in the corridor, even paced. No hurry. The conference room door opened. The man stopped in the doorway, assessed the room in approximately 1 second, and then he looked at Arthur and brought his right fist to his chest. "Commander Pendleton," he said, "we're in position." The title landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripple of it moving outward from the center in a silence that was almost physical. "Commander Pendleton." Margaret Sterling made a very small sound. Arthur turned from the window. The man who had walked into the room was not the same man who had sat across the mahogany table for the past 40 minutes, though they wore the same flannel shirt. Something had shifted in him, or rather, something had stopped being suppressed. The careful ordinariness he wore like a second skin had been folded and set aside, and what was underneath was something that the people in that room had no framework for, because none of them had ever been in proximity to it before. The particular, absolute stillness of someone who has been the most dangerous person in a room so many times that it has simply become a fact about them, like height or eye color. Richard Sterling found his voice. This is completely illegal. You can't just, you threatened to use government resources to remove a child from her home based on fabricated allegations," Arthur said. You used your political office to coerce a school board. You've been embezzling from the Greenvale Municipal Development Fund for 3 years, which is why you've been using this school and its board as a personal pressure tool, because the Sterling Foundation's donations to Oak Ridge give you leverage you need to maintain. He paused. We've known about the embezzlement for 14 months. I was waiting for a reason to close the file. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. You gave me a reason tonight, Arthur said. You mentioned my daughter's mother. The tablet that Agent Corrigan handed Arthur was already open to the first document. He set it on the mahogany table and turned it to face the room with the same motion a man might use to lay out a hand of cards. No theater, no delay. Just the clean arrival of consequence. The documents were extensive. Financial records, communication transcripts, shell company registrations in Margaret Sterling's maiden name, wire transfers that moved in patterns too deliberate to be coincidence and too irregular to be legitimate. Richard Sterling's embezzlement from Greenvale's municipal development allocation had been running for 38 months. The total figure, adjusted for the most recent transfers, was $4.7 million. The money had funded, among other things, 2 overseas vacation properties, a campaign contribution processing scheme that funneled money to Sterling's re-election fund, and the renovation of the Sterling Homes wine cellar, which featured a climate-controlled room for a collection of bottles that Richard Sterling had, in public, repeatedly described as my wife's little hobby. The district attorney had stopped typing some time ago. He was now reading the documents with the expressions of a man who is rapidly recalculating his proximity to criminal liability. Arthur Pendleton, Eleanor said quietly, from her end of the table. She wasn't asking. She was saying it in the way you say a name when you've just finished assembling something you've been working on for a while without knowing it. Arthur glanced at her briefly. I'll explain everything. After. He turned back to the table. In addition to the financial documents, there's a full forensic audit of the Oak Ridge Academy Board's decision-making processes over the past 3 years, cross-referenced with contributions from the Sterling Foundation. There are 17 separate instances of procedurally improper pressure on school leadership to act against the interests of specific families. The pattern is clear. He looked at Principal Holloway, who had the expression of a small man who had been doing a large man's bidding for too long and had reached the precise moment of reckoning. You have my sympathy, Dr. Holloway. The coercion on your position was significant. I'd recommend getting personal counsel tonight. Holloway nodded, once, in a way that encompassed both gratitude and the complete destruction of the life he had been living. Arthur looked at Agent Corrigan. Is the DA's office standing by? Yes, sir. They've had the package since 6:47. Good. He looked at Richard Sterling. Sterling had not moved in several minutes. His face had achieved a kind of arrested emptiness, the expression of a man watching the architecture of his life come apart at load-bearing points he had never thought to examine. Margaret Sterling had both hands pressed flat on the table and was staring at them as if she might find something useful there. The Greenvale County District Attorney's Office will be making arrests this evening, Arthur said. Both of you. The charges at this time include misappropriation of public funds, fraud, conspiracy, and because you threatened to manufacture a false CPS report against a child to coerce a parent, filing a false report, which in this state is a felony. He picked up the encrypted phone from the table. Your political career is over, Richard. Your foundation's charitable status will be revoked. The school's board will be restructured under independent oversight. The land that Oak Ridge Academy sits on, which is owned, as of a 2019 acquisition that went through 3 holding companies before reaching its actual parent entity, is owned by Pendleton Defense and Technology Group. Your annual ground lease is due for renegotiation. He paused. It will not be renewed under the current board composition. The silence in the room was total. Then Margaret Sterling, who had been still for so long that the movement seemed to startle even herself, looked at Arthur with an expression that had stripped itself of all its careful construction and revealed something underneath that might, in a different context, have been almost human. Fear. Genuine, unperformed fear. We didn't know, she said, and her voice had lost all its lacquer. We didn't know who you were. I know, Arthur said, without particular rancor. That's why I'm telling you. Because you should understand, very clearly, that the things you did to my daughter, the things your son did, the things you said in this room tonight, You didn't do them to a nobody. You did them to my family. He picked up his phone and his jacket from the chair. I want you to carry that. Two agents appeared in the doorway as if summoned. The arrests were quiet, efficient, and took less time than the meeting had. Eleanor sat at the end of the mahogany table long after the others had filed out, listening to the sound of the helicopters recede and the courtyard settling back into its sculpted silence. And somewhere outside, the distant pulse of blue and red light from the First County Sheriff's vehicles arriving in response to what would turn out to be the largest public corruption arrest in Greenvale County in 20 years. She picked up her portfolio, set it down again. Commander Pendleton. She sat with that for a moment longer. Then she got up and went to find him. He was in the courtyard. The agents had been given their stand down and were beginning the organized choreography of departure. Suburbans pulling out in sequence, the last Black Hawk banking away south over the tree line until the sound of it was something you felt rather than heard, and then not even that. The courtyard's fountain was still running, unperturbed, and the lights along the garden path were coming on in the early evening, warm and ordinary. Arthur was sitting on the memorial bench near the fountain, elbows on his knees, his face turned down. His flannel shirt was the same one he'd worn all day. He looked like someone who had just done something that cost him something. Not regret, exactly. Not relief. Something more complicated than either. Eleanor sat down beside him, which surprised her, because sitting beside people, uninvited, uncalculated, simply because the bench was where the person was not something she generally did. West Point Engineering and Strategic Operations, she said. He looked up. The ghost of something crossed his face. And covert operations. I left that part out. The helicopters filled in the gap. She paused. Pendleton Defense. The full name is Pendleton Defense and Technology Group. He looked at the fountain. My grandfather built it. My father took it from a mid-sized defense contractor to one of the top 10 global security technology firms in about 15 years. He was good at it. A beat. He died 4 years ago. I inherited the majority stake. I haven't taken an active role in the company, but I retain full authority. Why? She asked. Not accusingly. Genuinely. Arthur was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was the answer of a man who had thought about this question many times and had arrived at an answer that was simple and true enough that it didn't need to be defended. Because I wanted Lily to have a childhood, he said. A real one. Not helicopters and board meetings and a private security detail and a world where every person she meets is calculating what she's worth to them. He looked at his hands. I spent 15 years in a world where everything had a strategic value, including people. I didn't want that for her. Eleanor listened to this without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She was someone who processed information quickly and produced responses quickly, and had spent most of her life in rooms where silence was a disadvantage. But there was something about the way this man spoke, quietly, without performance, with the specific texture of a person saying exactly what they meant, that made her want to simply receive it. Lily, she said. She's not. She stopped, uncertain how to ask this without it sounding wrong. She's not biologically mine. He said it simply, without the rehearsed quality it might have had if he'd said it many times in situations that required defense. Her father was Marcus Webb, my second in command, best friend I ever had. He died on an operation in the Caucasus when Lily was 4 months old. His jaw was very still. Her mother died in childbirth. Marcus never. He stopped. Started again. He asked me to take her before we went in. As a precaution, he said, "You're the only person I trust to do this right." He wasn't expecting to use the precaution. Eleanor had stopped breathing in any aware way. The fountain ran. The garden lights were warm. I went through the formal adoption process, Arthur said. It took 11 months because of my security clearance and because certain interested parties thought it was irregular. It was irregular. None of that mattered. He looked at Eleanor directly for the first time since she'd sat down, and his expression had the quality of something that had been kept in a closed room for a long time and was now, carefully, being opened. She is my daughter. Every part of that sentence is true. Eleanor Vance had been called the Ice Queen since she was 26 years old. She had been called it to her face, in business contexts, as though it were a compliment. And behind her back, in the way that people call women cold when they mean unmanageable. She had worn it like armor because armor had been what she needed, and armor had worked, and she had become very good at maintaining the precise interior temperature that made her excellent at her work and deeply, specifically alone. She became aware, sitting on a memorial bench in the Oak Ridge Academy courtyard, that something had been melting in her for several weeks without her permission, and had now completed the process without her consent, and that there was nothing she could do about it, except acknowledge it. "You fixed the gate," she said. Her voice was slightly different. "The morning I first saw you. Nobody asked you to. You saw that it was broken, and you fixed it." He looked at her. "It was a safety issue." "I know." She looked down at her portfolio. "That's why I remember it." There was a silence between them that was nothing like the silences in boardrooms. It was warm, and it had the particular quality of two people who have stopped performing for each other and are simply, for the first time, in the same place. "The suit-wearing, helicopter-commanding version of you," Eleanor said carefully. "Does he eat soup for dinner and fix school gates for free?" Arthur smiled then, a real smile, the first one she'd seen from him that wasn't aimed primarily at Lily. It was a slow smile, produced without armor, and it changed the whole arrangement of his face in a way that made Eleanor feel something she would have described, in a board meeting, as a significant recalibration of existing assessments. "He tries to," Arthur said. "He tries." The Saturday morning that Eleanor Vance arrived at the Pendleton house, a small, solidly built craftsman on Aldermere Lane with a porch that needed one board replacing and flower boxes that were doing their best, she brought, because she did not know how to arrive at someone's home without bringing something, a bag from the bakery downtown. She stood at the door for 3 seconds longer than strictly necessary before knocking, Lily answered. She was wearing paint-stained overalls and had Gerald the one-eyed rabbit tucked under her arm and a smear of what appeared to be cadmium yellow on her left cheek. And she looked at Eleanor with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who has not yet learned to mask curiosity. "Dad said you might come," Lily said. "Did he?" "He said you fix things. Like he fixes things, but different kinds of things." She appeared to consider this satisfactory. "I'm painting. Do you want to see?" Eleanor had been in rooms where the question, "Do you want to see?" was asked professionally, by people who had spent weeks preparing what she was about to see. She had never been asked it by a 7-year-old in paint-stained overalls, and she was not prepared for the specific, sudden warmth of it. Very much, she said that Lily's paintings were spread across the kitchen table on newspaper, watercolors, mostly, with the vibrant, unbothered color palette of a child who hadn't yet learned that restraint was considered sophisticated. There was a field of enormous sunflowers, a house with very large windows, a man in a flannel shirt holding a small hand, rendered in the gestural shorthand of someone who had drawn this image many times because it was the most important image they knew. Eleanor stood looking at the paintings for a moment. "That's Dad," Lily said, pointing to the flannel figure. "I always make his hands too big." "They are pretty big hands," Eleanor said, which made Lily laugh. Arthur appeared from the back of the house with flour on his forearms, which solved the mystery of the warm smell emanating from the kitchen. He was making bread, actual bread, from scratch, because he was, as Eleanor was continuously discovering, a person of extraordinary and under-advertised depths. "You came," he said, and the way he said it suggested he had not been entirely certain she would. "I brought croissants," she said, which is redundant given the bread situation, but the gesture stands. "The gesture is welcome," he said. They baked the rest of the morning together, the three of them, in the small craftsman kitchen that smelled of yeast and warm oven and the old leather of Arthur's jacket hanging by the door. Lily narrated extensively, provided artistic direction regarding the shape of the bread rolls. "That one looks like a potato. Dad, it needs to be more oval," and at one point declared that Eleanor was folding the dough incorrectly and took over with the supreme confidence of a 7-year-old who has been watching her father bake since she was old enough to stand on a step stool. Eleanor had been in many kitchens. She had been in commercial kitchens with Michelin-starred chefs, in catered boardroom lunches, in the kitchens of houses that cost more than some nation's GDP. She had never been in a kitchen that felt quite like this, small, warm, slightly flour-dusted, loud with a child's running commentary, anchored by the quiet, sure presence of a man who kept handing her things, the rolling pin, the measuring cup, the clean dish towel, with the easy familiarity of someone who had decided, at some point, that she belonged here at a tea lunch, Lily showed Eleanor her art portfolio. Each page was annotated in Lily's careful 7-year-old handwriting, explaining what each painting was of and what she'd been trying to show. A sunset. I wanted the orange to be like when it's right before it disappears. A rain-wet street. It's our street, but prettier. The painting of the man with the 2 big hands. This is my dad. He is strong, but not scary. He is the kind of strong that is safe. Eleanor kept her face very still and breathed very carefully through the sentence, he is the kind of strong that is safe, because she was in front of a child and a man she was quite certain she was falling in love with, and neither context seemed appropriate for the specific dissolution she felt threatening her composure. In the evening, Lily fell asleep on the couch with Gerald and a chapter book, and Arthur and Eleanor sat on the porch in the early dark. The board that needed replacing creaked slightly under Arthur's weight. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog made a single comment about the evening and then was silent. Arthur was close enough that Eleanor could smell the old leather of his jacket. Warm, worn, honest, the smell of a man who didn't change who he was based on who was watching. I've been alone for a long time, Eleanor said. She said it in the way she said things she had decided to say rather than things she had let slip, deliberately, without apology, looking at the street rather than at him. I decided it was a preference. I was wrong about that. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then his hand moved, very slowly, and covered hers where it rested on the porch rail. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and it settled over hers with the careful certainty of a man who didn't make gestures he didn't mean. Lily needs someone to teach her to be a woman, he said. I can teach her a lot of things. I can't teach her that. Eleanor looked at him. In the porch light, a warm, single bulb in a glass lantern. His face was very clear, and she saw in it the full arrangement of who he was. The grief held at a functional level. The love that was so deep and structural it had reoriented his entire life. The careful patience of a man who had been waiting for something without being sure what it was. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was a quiet kiss, unhurried. The kind that asks a question and receives an answer in the same motion. He kissed her back with the same quality as everything else he did, completely, without reservation, with his whole attention. Inside, through the screen door, Lily made a small sound in her sleep and resettled herself, and Gerald fell off the couch and was not retrieved. The porch light was warm. The street was quiet. Somewhere on Aldermere Lane, a new thing had begun. Spring arrived at Oak Ridge Academy with the particular optimism that spring always brings to institutions that have recently undergone significant internal restructuring, which is to say that the new window boxes on the administrative wing were aggressively cheerful, and the new welcome signage at the school gates used a font that communicated open, forward-thinking, litigation-free in a way that the previous signage had not. The academy had been under independent oversight since January. The board had been reconstituted with 6 new members, 3 of whom were parents who had previously been marginalized by the Sterling-era regime. Principal Holloway, who had cooperated fully with the district attorney's investigation and provided 300 pages of documented coercion evidence, had been placed on administrative leave pending review and had, as of March, quietly resigned and taken a teaching position in Vermont, where he reportedly seemed much happier. Richard Sterling's trial was scheduled for the fall. His attorney had been making noises about plea negotiations for weeks. Margaret Sterling had retained separate counsel and was cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges, a transaction that her former PDA colleagues were absorbing with the distinct discomfort of people who have rearranged their social order around a fixed point and are now discovering that the fixed point has been removed. Connor Sterling had been enrolled, by court order linked to a youth diversion program, in a therapeutic school across town. His reappearance at Oak Ridge Academy was, by his parents' agreement, not anticipated. Eleanor Vance had spent 6 weeks after the night of the arrest doing what she did when she was processing something significant. She worked 18-hour days, attended 4 international conferences, restructured 2 divisions of Vance Capital Group, and had a single, uncharacteristically candid conversation with her assistant of 8 years, who had witnessed her operational mode through 3 corporate acquisitions and 1 hostile takeover, and who said, on the subject of Arthur Pendleton, simply, "Eleanor, for God's sake, don't overthink this one." She had, characteristically, overthought it for 3 more days, and then driven to Aldermere Lane on a Saturday morning with a bag of croissants, which had led to the kitchen, the bread, the porch, and the conclusion that sometimes the only accurate framework for a thing is the simplest one. By April, she knew Lily's painting schedule, her preferred reading genre, fantasy, specifically anything with dragons and girls who didn't need rescuing, the name and backstory of every stuffed animal in the bedroom rotation, and the particular way that Lily's left eye squinted when she was concentrating very hard on something, which was the same way Arthur's left eye squinted when he was concentrating very hard on something, which was a thing that Arthur pointed out one evening with an expression of such complete, uncomplicated joy that Eleanor had to look away for a moment to maintain composure. She did not, in fact, maintain composure. She was becoming significantly worse at maintaining composure around the Pendleton household, which her assistant found hilarious and her CFO found alarming, and which she herself had decided to consider a positive development. The spring showcase at Oak Ridge Academy was held on the second Saturday in May. It was a school-wide event, art, music, academic presentations, and it had been, under previous administration, a subtle and well-managed exercise in reinforcing the social hierarchy of the parent body. Under the new board's direction, it had become something considerably less subtle and considerably more actual, which is to say that the children's work was displayed on its own merits, without the invisible ranking system that had previously operated in the background, and that the catering was provided by a local bakery run by two mothers who had never previously been invited to contribute anything. Arthur arrived in his flannel shirt, the navy and green one, his favorite, and work boots, and held Lily's hand as they walked through the gates. The gate's hinges did not require attention. Someone from maintenance had fixed them in January, following a strongly worded letter from the new board's facilities chair. He was aware, in a low-key way, that several of the parents recognized him now, not from the arrest night specifically, but from the coverage that had followed it, the local news pieces, the regional paper's piece on the Sterling corruption case. He was also aware that none of them, currently, were making comments about his flannel shirt. This was not something he had arranged. It was simply a consequence, and it settled on him lightly, without particular satisfaction, because he had never cared about those comments and therefore felt nothing specific at their absence. That Lily's art, 3 watercolors submitted to the showcase, was displayed in the main hall. She stood in front of them with the specific pride of someone who knows the work is good and doesn't need to perform modesty about it. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had submitted a note to the board recommending Lily for the school's arts enrichment program, calling her work exceptional in its emotional intelligence and technical confidence. Arthur read the note 3 times and then folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. "Dad," Lily said, watching him, "you're going to cry." "I'm not going to cry," Arthur said. "You're doing the face." "I don't have a face." "You have a face," Eleanor said from behind them, appearing with 2 cups of coffee and the serenity of someone who had been watching this exchange repeat across multiple occasions and found it consistently delightful. She handed Arthur one of the cups. "It's the one where you're very still and your jaw does the thing." "My jaw doesn't do a thing," Arthur said. "Dad," Lily said patiently, "she's right." Arthur accepted this with the dignity of a man surrounded on 2 sides and wise enough to recognize a tactical position. He took the coffee. He looked at the paintings, the sunflowers, the rain-wet street, the flannel shirt figure with the 2 big hands, now hanging in a school that had once tried to take his daughter away from him, and felt something settle in his chest with the specific, weighted quality of things arriving in their proper place. Eleanor stood beside him, not performing anything, not calculating anything, just present, warm, holding her coffee, her shoulder an inch from his. Lily was already pulling Mrs. Patterson toward the second watercolor to explain its specific technical intentions. "She's going to be remarkable," Eleanor said. "She already is." The board approved the arts enrichment program yesterday. Full scholarship, no application required. It was unanimous. She paused. "I may have made a single phone call." Arthur looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression he had come to recognize as her version of the lopsided smile, composed on the surface, warm underneath, offered without condition. "Thank you," he said. "You don't need to thank me." "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She made a small sound that was not precisely a laugh, but was adjacent to one, and he found, as he always did, that it did something to his chest that no amount of flannel shirts or quiet, unassuming mornings or deliberate distance from the life he'd set aside could insulate him from. She had arrived in his life at his daughter's school in a broken-down Aston Martin and a cashmere blazer in the rain, and she had looked at his calloused hands with curiosity rather than condescension, and she had sat down beside him on a bench in an empty courtyard when she didn't have to, and she had let Lily take over the bread folding with the genuine, unaffected delight of someone encountering something they hadn't known they needed. He had spent 3 years building a life that asked very little of the world and gave very little of himself to anything outside of this small, complete family he had made from love and loss and a dying man's trust. He had not been unhappy. He had been, in the specific way of people who have survived things and learned to be grateful for the ordinary texture of daily life, quietly, sufficiently content. He had not known that sufficiency was not the same as wholeness. Across the hall, Lily was conducting what appeared to be a full artistic consultation with her teacher, gesturing at the rain-wet street painting with the focused authority of a 7-year-old who has opinions about visual perspective that she intends to be taken seriously. She caught Arthur's eye across the room and waved, a wide, whole-arm wave, entirely unself-conscious, lit up with the particular happiness of a child who has looked around at her life on a Saturday morning in May and found it exactly what it should be. Arthur raised his coffee cup in acknowledgement. He was standing in a school that had once tried to unmake him, wearing his favorite flannel shirt, holding coffee given to him by a woman who had seen every version of him, the broken-down truck end, the Blackhawks both, and had chosen, with full information, to be here. His daughter was laughing across a sunlit hall. The gate outside was on good hinges. The spring morning was doing what spring mornings do. The truest things, he had found, were almost always the simplest ones. That a child well loved is the most important work a person can do. That genuine strength is measured in what you protect, not what you project. That the armor people construct to survive the world sometimes keeps out exactly the thing the world has to offer that makes survival worth the effort. That love, real love, the kind built from showing up in flannel shirts in the rain and fixing gates that aren't yours and sitting on creaking porches in the dark and letting someone see all the versions of you and staying for all of them, is not a softness.it is the whole point. Eleanor touched his hand. He turned his palm over and held hers, and the sun came through the hall's high windows, and Lily laughed at something. And Arthur Pendleton stood in the middle of it all, the flannel and the helicopters, the grief and the grace, the loss that had become a family and the silence that had become a voice that said you are home. And he let himself, completely, for the first time in a very long time, simply be.